All right, let's go. Number 10. Roman Phalerica, the fire that water could not kill. In the 2nd century BCE, Roman siege engineers stood outside the walls of Saguntum in eastern Spain. They carried a weapon most people have never heard of, the Phalerica. A javelin, longer than a man is tall, tipped with a head of iron wrapped in tow and pitch. Historians like Livy recorded what happened next. The weapon was set ablaze before launch. It struck wooden siege towers, ship hulls, thatched rooftops, and it kept burning. Soldiers threw water on it. The flames climbed higher. Because the pitch didn't need oxygen from the air, it fed on itself. A fire designed specifically to defeat the one tool humans had always trusted to save them from fire. Water became useless. Entire fortifications were reduced to ash, while defenders stood helpless, buckets in hand. But here's where the story gets truly terrifying. The exact pitch composition, how the Romans engineered a compound that burned hotter when doused, was never fully written down. Fragments survive only in second-hand accounts, filtered through historians who saw the weapon's effects, but never its formula. Modern reconstructions using natural bitumen and resin get close. They don't quite replicate the ferocity described in the sources. Today, no lit Phalerica burns anywhere on Earth. What remains are scorched foundation stones beneath Saguntum, buried under 2,000 years of Spanish soil, and a formula that outlived the empire that built it. The city itself never surrendered. It burned to the ground rather than open its gates, an entire population choosing death over capture, while Phalerica fire lit the night sky. Archaeologists still find layers of ash and melted iron in the same soil. A fire so total, it left almost nothing else behind. Swallowed by silence, waiting in the archive of things we chose to forget. Number 9. Macuahuitl, the weapon shaped like lightning. At the heart of the Aztec Empire, in Tenochtitlan, priests and warriors depicted a weapon called Macuahuitl, the fire serpent. Carved into stone temple friezes dated to the 15th century, it appears in the hands of Huitzilopochtli, the god of war and the sun, at the moment he beheads his own sister. Archaeologists have recovered dozens of stone and wooden Macuahuitl representations across central Mexico. Its form is unmistakable, a curved, segmented body ending in an angular, lightning bolt head. Spanish chroniclers who witnessed Aztec ceremonies described it being wielded in ritual combat. But no functional, physical Macuahuitl weapon has ever been recovered intact. Only carvings. Only myth wrapped around an object nobody living has ever held. But here's where the story gets truly terrifying. Some codices suggest the Macuahuitl wasn't purely symbolic, that a real weapon existed, used in specific rites tied to solar eclipses and human sacrifice, and that its true function was deliberately erased when Spanish friars burned the vast majority of Aztec pictorial records in the 16th century. We don't know what the weapon actually did. We only know it terrified enough witnesses to be carved into stone for centuries. What's left now is silence in volcanic rock. A serpent with a lightning head, still staring out from museum shelves in Mexico City. Its purpose locked inside a language and a religion that colonization tried to erase completely. Nahuatl scholars today can translate the words that describe the Macuahuitl. Nobody alive can translate what it actually did in a warrior's hands, because the people who could explain it were never asked, and then were never given the chance to answer. Number 8. The War Elephant Terror System, Hannibal's psychological weapon. In 218 BCE, Hannibal Barca marched an army and 37 African war elephants across the Alps to invade Roman Italy. Ancient sources, including Polybius, describe Roman soldiers who had never seen an elephant fleeing in raw panic at first contact. Horses bolted, formations shattered. It wasn't a weapon of blades, it was a weapon of pure biological fear. The scale of the terror was staggering. At the Battle of the Trebia in 218 BCE, elephants alone routed entire Roman flanks before a sword was ever drawn. For a civilization that prided itself on discipline and order, this 4-ton trumpeting unknown broke something primal in the human mind, a fear response older than Rome itself. But here's where the story gets truly terrifying. Rome adapted faster than anyone expected. Within a single generation, Roman soldiers developed specific countertactics: fire, noise, targeted spear formations aimed at the elephant's handlers. By the time of the Battle of Zama in 202 BCE, the same weapon that once shattered legions was neutralized and turned back against Carthage. The terror weapon had an expiration date, measured in human adaptation, not in physics. What survives now are elephant skeletons unearthed near ancient battlefields in Italy and Tunisia, and a quiet lesson still buried in the bones. Hannibal himself, the man who commanded those 37 elephants across the Alps, died decades later by his own hand, rather than be captured by the very Romans who had once fled from his animals in terror. A final, bitter irony that the terror weapon outlived. Humanity's greatest weapon was never technology. It was how fast we learned not to be afraid. Number 7. Ancient Chinese fire lance, the ancestor of every gun on Earth. In 950 CE, during the late Tang Dynasty, Chinese military texts describe a bamboo tube packed with gunpowder, mounted on a spear, capable of shooting a jet of flame, and sometimes shrapnel, directly into an enemy's face. Historians consider it the direct ancestor of every firearm that would ever be built. The scale of what this represents is almost impossible to grasp. 6 centuries before European hand cannons appeared, Chinese soldiers were already combining incendiary chemistry with battlefield delivery systems. The Wujing Zongyao, a military manuscript compiled around 1044 CE, contains the earliest known illustrated gunpowder formulas on Earth, decades before anyone else in the world understood the science. But here's where the story gets truly terrifying. Early fire lances weren't just weapons. They were also uncontrolled explosions waiting to happen. The gunpowder mixtures were unstable, the bamboo barrels fragile, and soldiers who wielded them were sometimes killed by their own weapon before it ever reached the enemy. China had unlocked the chemistry that would eventually reshape all of human warfare, and the earliest users paid for that discovery with their own bodies. What remains are brittle bamboo fragments in Chinese museum collections, and a manuscript, the Wujing Zongyao, that quietly holds the ignition point of a technological chain reaction still detonating across the modern world. Every rifle, every artillery shell, every firearm manufactured today traces its ancestry back through 1,000 years of refinement to a single, unstable bamboo tube, ignited by a soldier who may not have survived to see whether it worked. Number 6. Archimedes' heat ray, mirrors that burned ships from the shore. In 213 BCE, during the Roman siege of Syracuse, ancient writers claim the mathematician Archimedes devised a defense using mirrors, polished bronze surfaces angled to concentrate sunlight onto approaching Roman ships until they burst into flame. For centuries, historians dismissed it as legend. Then, in 2005, a team at MIT decided to actually test it. Using an array of small mirrors focused on a wooden mock-up roughly 100 feet away, they successfully ignited the target within minutes, but only under precise, unmoving, cloudless conditions. The experiment proved the physics were possible. It also proved something else. On a chaotic battlefield, with moving ships and shifting clouds, the weapon may have been nearly impossible to use reliably. But here's where the story gets truly terrifying. No ancient source from Archimedes' own lifetime describes the heat ray directly. The story appears only in accounts written centuries later, raising the unsettling possibility that Syracuse's defenders achieved something so devastating that it curdled into myth before anyone wrote it down accurately, and that the myth is the only fragment of the truth that survived. What's left is a besieged Sicilian coastline, an MIT experiment that proved the theory but not the history, and a mathematician's death at a Roman soldier's hand shortly after. Plutarch wrote that a Roman soldier killed Archimedes while he was in the middle of a mathematical problem, drawing geometric shapes in sand, oblivious to the fact that his own city had already fallen around him. Roman general Marcellus had reportedly given orders that Archimedes be captured alive, wanting the mind behind Syracuse's defenses spared. The order arrived too late. The one man capable of explaining exactly how the mirrors worked died mid-calculation, and the answer died in the sand beside him. Number 5. The Aztec Macuahuitl, a wooden sword sharper than surgical steel. Spanish conquistadors who invaded Mexico in 1519 wrote in terror about a weapon carried by Aztec warriors, the Macuahuitl. A flat wooden club, roughly 3 feet long, its edges embedded with rows of obsidian blades lashed into grooves with plant fiber and resin. Modern material science has confirmed something the conquistadors could barely explain. Obsidian, a volcanic glass, fractures at the molecular level into an edge that can measure just 3 nanometers wide, sharper than a modern surgical scalpel. Spanish accounts describe a single blow from a Macuahuitl decapitating a horse. Bernal Diaz del Castillo, a soldier present during the conquest, documented wounds from the weapon that steel armor failed to fully stop. But here's where the story gets truly terrifying. Despite its lethality, not one complete pre-contact Macuahuitl survives today. The only detailed example known to scholars, held in a Madrid armory, was destroyed in a fire in 1884, leaving us with drawings, Spanish testimony, and stone blades alone, but never the finished weapon that made a nation of conquistadors write home in fear. What remains are obsidian shards scattered across excavation sites in the Valley of Mexico, edges still capable of cutting skin after 500 years buried in the dirt, sharper, even now, than most things forged in fire. Modern surgeons have actually used freshly knapped obsidian scalpels in specialized procedures, because the edge leaves a cleaner cut than steel and heals with less scarring. A weapon built for war in 1519 is, in some operating rooms, still cutting today. Number 4. Roman Scorpio, the machine that never missed. Roman legions carried a weapon few people picture when they think of ancient Rome, the Scorpio, a torsion-powered bolt thrower small enough for a 2-man crew to operate, yet accurate enough to strike a man-sized target at over 100 meters. Julius Caesar himself references it in his account of the Gallic Wars, describing its use against enemy formations with devastating precision. The engineering behind it was staggering for its era. Twisted skeins of sinew or hair stored torsional energy, releasing it through a wooden arm to fire iron-tipped bolts with enough force to punch through shields and armor alike. A trained crew could reload and fire roughly 3 times per minute, turning a battlefield into a killing field from a distance no enemy commander expected. But here's where the story gets truly terrifying. Ancient sources describe entire units of Scorpios positioned along Roman siege lines, capable of picking off individual enemy officers by name recognition of armor and rank. Essentially, precision sniping, 2,000 years before the concept existed in modern warfare. The psychological effect on enemy leadership, watching their own commanders drop from an invisible distance, is barely documented because so few survived to describe it. What's left are fragments of iron bolt heads recovered from Gallic and British battlefield sites, and the sinew and wood mechanism itself, gone completely. Organic torsion springs don't survive 2,000 years in the ground the way iron does, which means every reconstruction built today is an educated guess dressed up as certainty. The exact tension ratios that made it so lethally consistent lost somewhere in the collapse of the empire that built it. Number 3. The Moldavian chain bomb, the weapon that tore ships apart. In the 15th century, along the fortified river defenses of Moldavia under rulers like Stephen the Great, chroniclers describe a brutal naval and siege weapon, forged iron shot linked by heavy chain, fired in pairs from cannon to spin violently through the air and shred anything with rigging, sails, or exposed troops in formation. The mechanism was as elegant as it was horrifying. 2 projectiles connected by chain, launched simultaneously from a single barrel or paired guns. Once airborne, the chain went taut, and the whole assembly began to spin like a scythe, capable of severing masts, shredding sailcloth into ribbons, and cutting through packed ranks of infantry in a single pass. It was designed not just to kill, but to dismantle. But here's where the story gets truly terrifying. Because the weapon relied on split-second synchronized ignition between 2 cannon, misfires were common and catastrophic. Chain shot that launched unevenly could snap back toward the very crew that fired it, turning the weapon into an indiscriminate blade with no fixed direction. Historical accounts from the region hint at gun crews as wary of their own weapon as the enemy fleets it was built to destroy. What remains are rusted iron fragments, occasionally recovered from riverbeds in modern Romania and Moldova. Twisted chain links, still fused to shot after 5 centuries underwater. Local folklore in the region still holds fragments of stories about cannon crews who refused to fire the weapon twice in the same battle, having watched it turn on their own lines once already. a weapon that spun through the air, trailing violence in both directions at once. Number 2. Damascus Steel, a formula lost with carbon nanotubes inside it. Beginning around the 3rd century CE and reaching its peak between the 9th and 17th centuries, blacksmiths across the Middle East and South Asia forged blades from a material called Wootz steel, what Crusader-era Europeans would come to call Damascus steel. The blades carried a distinctive rippling wave-like pattern across the metal, and a reputation that outlasted every empire that wielded them. The scale of what these blades could do bordered on the impossible for their era. Historical accounts describe Damascus blades slicing through a silk scarf floating in midair, and cutting cleanly through lesser European swords without dulling. In 2006, materials scientists studying preserved Damascus blades under electron microscopy found something nobody expected: carbon nanotubes and cementite nanowires embedded directly in the steel's structure. Nanotechnology, centuries before the word existed. But here's where the story gets truly terrifying. The exact ore source and smelting process that produced these nanostructures was never written down by the smiths who guarded it. By the 18th century, the specific Wootz ore deposits in India that made the effect possible were exhausted, and with them, the last living link to the technique vanished. Modern metallurgists have gotten close. Nobody has fully replicated the original. What remains are a handful of museum-held blades, their nanostructured edges still holding a whisper-thin sharpness after 700 years, and a smelting secret buried with smiths who took it, deliberately, silently, to their graves. Modern researchers have tried recreating the process using historical trace element analysis of surviving ore samples, chasing a chemistry that depended on impurities in a specific mine that simply doesn't exist anymore. Some metallurgists now believe the nanotube structures formed only under a precise, narrow temperature window that ancient smiths controlled by instinct and generations of trial and error, never fully able to explain in words what their own hands already knew, a formula the earth itself helped erase. Number 1. Greek fire, the weapon that burned on water and vanished with an empire. In 672 CE, the Byzantine Empire faced annihilation. An Arab fleet approached Constantinople, and Byzantine engineers unleashed something the ancient world had never seen: a liquid incendiary weapon pumped through bronze siphons mounted on ships that ignited on contact and kept burning even when it hit open water. Historians credit a Syrian engineer named Kallinikos with perfecting the formula that saved the empire that day. The scale of what Greek fire represented was civilization-altering. For nearly 800 years, it functioned as the Byzantine Empire's ultimate deterrent, a weapon so devastating that its mere reputation kept invading fleets at bay. Emperors guarded the formula as a state secret more closely than any military strategy, passing partial knowledge only to a single trusted family of engineers at a time, generation after generation. But here's where the story gets truly terrifying. When Constantinople finally fell to the Ottoman Turks in 1453, the exact formula for Greek fire didn't fall with the walls. It simply vanished. The chain of engineers who alone knew the complete process was broken, deliberately or through the chaos of the empire's collapse, and no complete written recipe has ever been recovered. Modern chemists have proposed naphtha, quicklime, sulfur, and pine resin as components. None of their reconstructions burn quite like the accounts describe, igniting on contact with water instead of being extinguished by it. What's left now is silence beneath the Bosphorus, the ruins of a fallen empire, and a formula that outlived every person who ever knew it completely. For 8 centuries, Greek fire held back the tide of 2 empires and countless invading fleets, and then, in a single generation, it disappeared as completely as if it had never existed at all. A fire humanity built once, and has never been able to build again. 10 weapons, 10 centuries, 10 formulas, techniques, and machines that our ancestors mastered so completely they reshaped the outcome of empires, and then lost so thoroughly that modern science, with every tool at its disposal, still can't fully rebuild what they built by hand. That's the part that should unsettle you. It isn't that ancient people were primitive, it's that they were capable of things we still can't fully explain, using knowledge that simply evaporated the moment the last person who understood it died without passing it on completely. Look at the pattern underneath all 10 of these. Greek fire, guarded so tightly it vanished with the empire that hoarded it. Damascus Steel, dependent on an ore vein that ran dry before anyone thought to write down why it mattered. The Macuahuitl, erased not by time but by the deliberate burning of an entire civilization's written memory. The Phalarica, buried under the ash of a city that chose annihilation over surrender. Knowledge doesn't survive by accident. It survives because someone, somewhere, chooses to pass it on. And every one of these weapons proves how easily that chain can be broken, one silence at a time. Every civilization believes its knowledge is permanent. Every civilization has been wrong. We assume the internet, our libraries, our data centers are different, too vast, too redundant, too digital to ever go dark the way a single Byzantine bloodline of engineers went dark in 1453. But the people who guarded Greek fire believed the same thing about their own knowledge. Somewhere beneath a river, a temple floor, or the silt of the Bosphorus, the next lost formula is still waiting, and we won't know what we've lost until long after it's gone. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now, and make sure to subscribe.